So let's get to that question of why do some populations fluctuate up and down fairly dramatically while others tend to remain fairly constant over long periods of time. What we're talking about is the study of population dynamics. Of course, dynamics means the change within that population. And it's going to focus on a pretty complex interaction. Everything in biology tends to be fairly complex between the biotic, the living, and the abiotic, the non-living factors that causes this variation in size, this change up and down, up and down. So we want to look at either stability or fluctuation. Long-term population studies have challenged the hypothesis that population of large mammals are relatively stable over time. It was generally thought for a long time that big creatures, say elephants or sheep or alligators or any fairly large creature, of course, sorry, alligator's not a mammal, but especially large mammals tended to have long-term stability within their population size. But what we've actually seen is that's not necessarily the case. There are many instances where population size of large land-based mammals or other large mammals fluctuates just as much as lots of the other creatures. Lots of things can affect this. Weather and predator population can have a big effect on population size over time. A good example of this is the moose population on Isle Royale. This is a large land-based mammal. You would think it would have a fairly steady population, that it's probably at its carrying capacity and is going to have a nice, basically a baseline straight line there. But we have seen this moose population, as it's been studied over the years, kind of a crash and rise and crash and rise numerous times. A good example is a collapse that occurred during a fairly harsh winter and when wolf numbers peaked. So it was a combination of the increase in the number of predators plus a pretty bad environmental condition of a harsh winter, and those two took a toll and really caused the population density to decrease by quite a bit. So all creatures can have these fluctuations, but there are some that tend to remain more stable than others, and then there are some that tend to kind of rise and fall more dramatically. Here's that example I just talked about. This was from 1959 to 2008. This island called Isle Royale. The fluctuation in moose and wolf populations here. You can actually kind of see a pattern too, where when the wolf population rises, the moose population falls, and when the wolf population decreases, the moose population rises. And they kind of have this step pattern where one sort of follows right behind the other. You see this very often in predator-prey population changes. A great example they show in your textbook is between the lynx, which is like a large cat, sort of like a large bobcat, and the hare, rabbit population. This is a good example of populations that undergo this cyclical change, this kind of boom and bust cycle. The lynx population tends to follow the 10-year boom and bust cycle of the hare population, and there have actually been 3 different ideas or hypotheses that have been proposed to explain this 10-year interval of the hare population. So it's easy to understand why the lynx population rises and falls, because it's simply following the hare population. But the big question is, why does the hare population rise and fall so dramatically every 10 or 11 years? So here is what their chart looks like, and again you can see as one population rises and falls, the other tends to rise and fall right behind it, because of course they are very closely linked, and the hare is one of the lynx's primary food sources. So it makes sense that the lynx population size would follow the hare's population size. So then the question is, what's causing the rabbit population to rise and dip about every 10 years or so? Your book discusses 3 possible hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 was that the hare population cycle follows a cycle of winter food supply. So if this hypothesis is correct, then the cycle should stop if food supply is increased. So that's what the scientists did, was they provided additional food to the hare population. They wanted to see is if they provided additional food, would this kind of break the cycle? Was it the amount of food available due to the summer-winter cycle that caused this whole 10-year change? So what they did is they provided additional food, and what the scientists found was that didn't seem to be what caused the cycle, because although additional food did increase the overall population size of the hares, it didn't stop this 10-year up and down cycle. So this data does not support the first hypothesis. Hypothesis number 2 was that the main factor was the hare population being driven down by predators, and so they conducted studies to find out how many of these hare population decreases were due to predators, and about 90% of the hares were killed by predators. So the data would seem to support that predation was a major factor in the hare population rise and fall. And of course we already kind of know that because we saw the chart where one of the predators, the lynx, tended to follow the same pattern. So yes, I would suspect that predation was a big factor, but that doesn't seem like it would explain the entire 10-year cycle. So perhaps there's another factor, but the data did support this second hypothesis that predation was a major factor in this cycle that we see. The third hypothesis is probably the most interesting one. The third hypothesis was that the hare population cycle was actually linked or related to sunspot cycles. Sunspot activity affects light quality, and that in turn affects the quantity and quality of the food supply for the hares, of course, because they're herbivores. And there's a good correlation between sunspot activity and hare population size. The sun actually goes through regular cycles of activity every 10 to 12 years on average, and there's a little chart right down there, and some sunspots and various other solar activity is part of this cycle. So while it may seem pretty far-fetched, it does seem like there's strong support for this idea that the solar cycle affects the hare population cycle, which then in turn affects the lynx population cycle. So if you put all this data together, the results of all these experiments suggest that both predation and sunspot activity regulate the hare numbers, and then of course that food availability is important, but it seems to play less of a role in this cycle that we see. Finally, one last factor to briefly mention, that would be immigration and emigration and what we call metapopulations. Pretty much up to this point we've been focusing only on births and deaths, the birth rate and the death rate, and how that affects the population dynamics. But of course we also need to take into account the fact that some creatures move in, some creatures move out. So remember that immigration with an I is creatures coming in, and emigration with an E is creatures moving out. When things get crowded, it's time to emigrate, and so when population density rises, you tend to have a greater amount of immigration outward, and that will of course lower the population density and size. One last thing your textbook talks about is this group of amoebas. I don't even know how to say the name here. It looks like Dictyostelium, always hard to pronounce, can immigrate and forage better than individual amoebas if they move and work as a group. And so it talks about how they will immigrate or move as a group, and they actually tend to work as a team, and they can immigrate farther and they can get to further food supplies. And so it's kind of interesting that you see some of these same patterns, not just in large animals like lynx and moose and wolves, but also even down to microscopic creatures like amoeba. You see some of these same population dynamics occurring. And then finally, for this concept, the textbook mentions this idea of metapopulations. Metapopulations are groups of populations linked by immigration and emigration. So for example, we could examine the human population of Waxahachie all by itself, or we could kind of examine the human population of Waxahachie separate from Red Oak, separate from Balk Springs. We could look at those individually, and they are certainly populations. You could define Waxahachie as a particular population of humans. You probably have a sign on the city limits that does exactly that. But it might be better off and more helpful for us to examine the entire human population, the metapopulation of the metroplex, because there's going to be a lot of immigration and immigration back and forth between Waxahachie and Red Oak and Dallas and Arlington, and it's a very fluid population moving in and out of these various subset populations. So if we looked at all of the metroplex, we might consider that the metapopulation, and because there is so much movement, that would probably be more helpful for us. High levels of immigration combined with higher survival can result in greater stability in populations. So if you have lots of creatures coming in and higher survival rates, you can have a little bit greater stability in your populations. The textbook kind of mentions this using this particular type of butterfly, where overall they move around quite a bit. You can see the occupied patches and the unoccupied patches. So you have all these individual populations, but there's a lot of immigration and immigration, and so overall the metapopulation is fairly stable, even though any of these individual populations may kind of rise and fall fairly dramatically. So that's a good example of kind of getting a more big picture look at population dynamics. We're going to stop right there. Our very last concept we'll take a look at is about the human population and the human population growth here on Earth, and we'll get to that last in just a moment.